So one of the most interesting aspects about our industry is the global elements of it, and some of the facets of global that come to play in day-to-day hospitality operations. Some pretty interesting implications.
Well, you know, globalization is kind of a tricky word, I think. When we think about globalization, we oftentimes think about a sort of universality, a standardization of things around the world. When in fact most businesses really don't pursue global strategies. A few do, but a lot of the businesses in hospitality probably pursue something closer to a transnational type of strategy, where you take the best of standardized practices and procedures, back of house operating elements, but you also create that uniqueness, that difference that's somewhat tied to place. I think if you're not tying it to place, then sometimes it's not a very profound hospitality product. So there are national strategies or transnational strategies that are probably more prevalent approaches for many organizations than a global strategy that assumes standardization across a region or across the world.
Well, from a standpoint of organization, operation, and management and so forth, I would agree. But on the other hand, we think about the diversity and variances of growth rates globally. So what we're seeing now is significant growth in Asia and Latin America, for example, and in certain other spots, even southern parts of Africa. And now what you have is, for these enterprises, differences and variations of source markets and where the customers are coming from.
Right.
And that's on top of providing, if you will, international or transnational operations.
From my perspective, the global story is that hospitality industries are found everywhere in the world. You know, the way investors react to them is different. Bill just mentioned some growth in Africa. Africa is the most under-hoteled market in the world in terms of the hotel industry. There's more demand there than there is supply. The problem with Africa is investors demand a very, very high rate of return on their investment because the space is seen as so risky. And so there's a lot of diversity in what's considered a fair return for even the same product. Five-star hotel in an urban core. If you locate that in Nairobi, it'd be very different from being in Shanghai or being in New York City. Capital likes to earn returns, but a capital also likes to preserve itself. And the way that capital responds is generally when an industry is growing and returns are seen as good, capital flows in, and when returns are not seen good, either capital flows out or doesn't enter those markets. But the practices are quite different around the world. In some sense, it's because of capital status around the world. There are certain societies or certain places where capital is of lower status, and it's treated very differently than in more capitalist-oriented societies.
Indeed, I see the many parallels in human resources and employment in the same regard. There's efforts to try to create, standardization of practice so that you can ensure some consistency. Yet we also know that there's a lot of uniqueness on that local level that has to be accounted for. So you really can't pursue a one-size-fits-all model. It all has to be very customized to the local needs of the place where you're operating. So that's one of the things that I think, balancing those different demands makes this a very interesting and very noteworthy kind of challenge.
You're right. It seems sort of fascinating. You've suggested that, in a sense, the money piece is pretty local, right? The capital is local, and then in many respects, the execution of service and the fundamentals of hospitality are driven by local. So I imagine that part of what makes this complex and intriguing is trying to figure out what are the best practices globally that others are doing that can be imitated and adapted and adjusted while still respecting the nature of place, the nature of uniqueness and its purpose, since that's kind of fundamental to the whole travel experience.
And now, speaking for marketing, how do you make that connection? How do you take a global consumer base and communicate, if you will, a local experience opportunity and make that work? It's a tough job. It's a tough job.
Requires one of those broad integrative lenses that we were talking about earlier.
Yep.
So I think the insightful leaders in this industry really understand how these different dynamics play out, and they understand the very nature and specific aspects of what those local demands are, and can balance those with the other kinds of requirements that are necessary to be successful.
One thing that really intrigues me is that even how we signal with price varies by culture, by place. So that when we've done some studies around pricing and pricing dynamics in different parts of the world, some of the patterns are the same, but other parts of the world, we find that even consumers adjust to the notion of price fundamentally differently. So I think there's a lot to be learned about consumers in different parts of the world and how they interface with the tourism product.
You bet. Value is price and what the services are, and it's a tough connection to communicate.
Indeed.